Hello, everybody. Lovely to see so many people. Lovely to be back in the hall after what has seemed to be quite a long and slow post-COVID recovery. Welcome, everybody online. Welcome, everybody here. This is a special event, which is the first in a series of Waddesdon Club seminars, webinars, which is organised by Chatham House. The mission of the Waddesdon Club is to support the mainstreaming of climate change considerations into economic and financial decisions, both domestically and internationally. And it gives me extreme pleasure to, and honour to welcome the Right Honourable Alok Sharma, COP26 President, to speak, as we all know. COP26 in Glasgow was the most important climate meeting since Paris. This was the first meeting to advance the NDC ratchet mechanism to drive up climate ambition. It was therefore a key opportunity to test whether the Paris Agreement is working to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees. It also builds on much new science, including the IPCC reports, especially AR6, which came out earlier, and the 1.5 degree special report, which really highlighted that every 0.1 degree matters in terms of its impacts. COP26 also occurred in a year marked by extreme weather, wildfires, heat waves, floods, that make the issue of climate change both real and tangible to citizens worldwide. As the COP26 president, Mr. Sharma played the lead role in the preparations for the summit, rallying countries across the world to raise their ambition and brokering the Glasgow Climate Pact, the summit's main agreement, a mammoth and emotional task right to the wire. Speaking shortly after COP26, Mr. Sharma concluded that COP26 had kept 1.5 degrees alive, but that its pulse was weak. It will only survive if promises are kept and pledges translated into action. Today's event allows Mr. Sharma to reflect on the success of the Glasgow summit and set out the UK's priority for the rest of the presidency up to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. He has recently visited the hosting countries of COP27 and COP28, Egypt and the UAE together, and so can also report on how COP26 and the UK presidency can shape the immediate future of ambition, particularly around agreeing further revisions of the NDCs and on public and private climate finance, including greening the global financial system. There is also the issue of how the UK presidency plans to deliver for climate vulnerable countries, ensuring that richer countries honour their commitments on adaptation and loss and damage. So that is the topic of today's event. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. This event will be on the record and is being recorded and live streamed. If you feel you want to tweet, please do, using the Twitter handle, the hashtag #CHEvents. We will have a question and answer session in the second half an hour. And if you're online, please go through the speech and put questions into the Q&A function. People in the physical audience will be able to raise their hand. So without further ado, and without wasting any more time, over to you, Mr. Sharma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Benton, for that kind introduction, and thank you to Chatham House for hosting me today. Friends, around the world, 2021 saw troops mobilize, violence erupt, and relations between old friends and allies strained. Wars dragged mercilessly on, and tensions mounted between some of the world's great powers. And all around us, we saw a fractured and fractious world as the pandemic continued to cause devastation across the globe. And yet, in a temporary structure on the banks of the River Clyde, 197 countries came together at COP26. And they committed to take action on climate. And they forged the Glasgow Climate Pact. And they did this because they broadly recognize three truths. Truths which impact every country on Earth. Truths which should be uncontroversial, though some still seek to undermine them. First, that this planet is our only home, and we are in danger of destroying it. The science is clear: human activity is responsible for our changing climate. Second, that inaction or delayed action on climate will create immense risks and costs, and populations across the world demand leaders to respond, and to respond now. And third, alongside the invaluable environmental dividend, there is an economic dividend to be reaped from tackling climate change, a fact that's been recognized by global business and finance. In short, climate is a space where national and global interests align. And as a result, leaders recognize that despite other differences, cooperation at COP26 was in our collective self-interest. 12 weeks ago, from the start of that summit, 12 weeks exactly today, those same leaders who came to Glasgow have a clear choice to make. And it's one to be made in full knowledge of its consequences. Do they match the powerful rhetoric that we heard with concrete action? Do they honor the promises made in Glasgow? Or do they allow our success to wither on the vine? I believe that the collective self-interest that helped COP26 to succeed must now drive us to nurture the spirit of global cooperation forged in Glasgow and honor the Glasgow Climate Pact. And that is the essence of the argument that I want to make today. And I want to set out how the UK will work over our COP26 presidency year to keep the world on course. First, however, I want to unpack that central idea that collective self-interest led to success at Glasgow. In 2015, countries came together and formed the Paris Agreement. And in it, they agreed to limit global heating to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century, pursuing efforts to limit this rise to 1.5 degrees. And yet, in August last year, the IPCC published its 6th assessment report on the physical science of climate change, the findings of which are based on the distillation of 14,000 scientific papers and agreed by 195 countries. And that report concluded that we have already reached average global warming of 1.1 degrees, and that human activity is unequivocally to blame, and that we were on track to breach the 1.5 degree limit within 2 decades. So when we arrived in Glasgow, it was clear that COP26 was our last best hope of keeping that 1.5 degree limit within reach. And leaders understood that. And they could see the effects of our warming world around them. Last year, we saw devastating floods across Asia and Europe. Wildfires raged in the US and Australia, and reports of storms, cyclones, and record-breaking temperatures were everywhere. And the science is very clear. The higher temperatures rise, the worse the situation will become, and every country will suffer the consequences. Climate change does not recognize borders. At 1.5 degrees warming, 700 million people across the world will experience extreme heat. At 2 degrees, it'll be 2 billion. We also know that there are what our host, Chatham House, calls the systemic cascading risks of global heating. These are the knock-on effects resulting from climate impacts such as food and water insecurity, pests and diseases, and the loss of lives, livelihoods, and infrastructure. Indeed, in one of its recent reports, Chatham House makes the case that such factors could ultimately displace people, disrupt markets, undermine political stability, and exacerbate conflict. Where people's ability to feed their families becomes precarious, and extreme weather and diseases wipe out livelihoods, people may be forced from their homes, and civil unrest may ferment. events that can undermine fragile government and reverberate around the globe. And it is because climate is central to geopolitics that the UK's integrated review established tackling climate change and biodiversity loss as the UK's top international priority. But friends, this is as much a question of economics as security. Climate change also threatens catastrophic economic damage, just as we're repairing the harm inflicted by the pandemic. Lord Stern and others have described how climate change will damage the productive capacity of the world economy, harming natural, human, and physical capital. And ultimately, it will disrupt the trade that crisscrosses the planet and restrain the global economy's ability to grow. Back in 2006, the Stern Review estimated that unmitigated climate change could incur equivalent costs to wiping out as much as 20% of global GDP every year. And here, in the United Kingdom last year, the Office for Budget Responsibility projected that unchecked climate change could lead to public debt reaching a staggering 289% of GDP by the end of the century. And this, of course, would be a result of coping with extreme weather at home and the knock-on effects of even greater damage in hotter countries. Anyone who believes in fiscal responsibility should balk at the idea that we would laden future generations with such unsustainable levels of avoidable debt. By contrast, the OBR estimates that if we act now, the transition to net zero could add around 21% of GDP to government debt by mid-century, though of course policy choices could reduce this figure, and I would add that it includes investments with long-term benefits. Given the impacts of global heating, it's not surprising that people around the world are demanding action, as indeed I've heard firsthand from civil society and young people across the globe. Last year, a survey of over 1 million people in 50 countries found that almost 2/3 described climate change as an emergency. Research published last September found that almost 60% of young people globally felt that governments were, and I quote, betraying me and future generations. And I'm absolutely certain that the unrelenting calls from civil society for leaders to act helped to focus minds in Glasgow. So just as the science has become starker and the risks have become clearer and the calls to action have grown louder, the opportunities presented by tackling climate change are increasingly evident. Net zero is one of the clearest economic trends there has ever been. It is vast in scope, encompassing every country and every sector. And it represents an enormous economic opportunity, one that is being seized by companies, by countries, and by financial institutions around the world. I've traveled on a prototype hydrogen bus in India. I've witnessed agricultural innovation to reduce emissions and boost productivity in Brazil. I've met communities in Kenya connected to reliable power for the first time, thanks to solar. And around the world, markets are on the move. The amount of power generated by solar and wind has increased close to 7-fold in a decade. Internationally, the coal power pipeline has reduced over 75% since 2015. And domestically, the answer to cutting emissions, keeping bills under control, and ensuring domestic security of supply is to continue to build out our world-leading offshore wind sector and invest in nuclear and hydrogen as the government is doing. Major car manufacturers such as General Motors, Volvo, and JLR have committed all of their new car sales to being zero emissions by 2035 or earlier. Financial institutions with over $130 trillion of assets on their balance sheets have committed to stringent net zero targets to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And over 60% of the UK's FTSE 100 companies have done the same through the Race to Zero campaign. As a CEO of a major multinational said to me recently, a few years ago, a corporate was considered an outlier if it was setting out plans to go to net zero. Now, they're an outlier if they're not. And an explanation for this was set out clearly in a letter last week from Larry Fink to chief executives of companies in which BlackRock invests. He wrote, and I quote, "It's been 2 years since I wrote that climate risk is investment risk. And in that short period, we have seen a tectonic shift of capital. Sustainable investments have now reached $4 trillion. Actions and ambitions towards decarbonization have also increased. This is just the beginning. The tectonic shift towards sustainable investing is still accelerating. Every company and every industry will be transformed by the transition to a net zero world. The question is, will you lead or will you be led?" I agree. That is indeed the question for business. Clean is competitive, and the global race to supply the technologies and solutions a net zero world needs is on. The train, my friends, is pulling out of the station, and countries and companies that want to remain competitive need to leap on now. We know too that the move to green economies creates good green jobs. The International Energy Agency has estimated that about 30 million new workers are needed by 2030 to meet increased demand in the clean economy. The International Labour Organization has projected that in the transition to a low-carbon economy, some sectors could see 4 times more jobs created than there are lost. And there is a clear economic case to adapt to climate change, to protect people and nature from its effect. The United Nations Environment Programme, for example, estimates that investing in measures like early warning systems and flood defences could yield over 4 times the return in avoided costs and social and environmental benefits. So, what I came to understand from the numerous conversations I held with leaders and ministers over the past 2 years is that countries recognize all of this. They can see domestically what is happening to their climate and its consequences. The science has hit home. The risks have resonated, and the opportunities are increasingly clear. And as a result, a collective self-interest emerged. All countries saw that it was in their interest to come to Glasgow to cooperate and to keep the 1.5 limit alive. And we did keep 1.5 alive, thanks to what we achieved both in and outside the negotiating rooms. Ahead of the summit, a number of countries, though not enough, came forward with enhanced emissions reduction commitments, or NDCs, showing that the Paris Agreement is working. And at COP26, almost 200 countries came together and agreed the historic Glasgow Climate Pact. And in doing so, they demonstrated that climate can create a space for cooperation amongst a splintered global politics, that the world can work together to improve our common future, to address major global challenges, and to seize opportunities. The Glasgow Climate Pact recognizes the science. It calls on countries to phase down unabated coal power and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. It requests countries to revisit and strengthen their 2030 emission reduction targets as necessary to align with the Paris temperature goal by the end of this year. And it contains ambitious text on loss and damage. It commits us to rapidly scale up climate finance and to double finance for adaptation by 2025. And of course, we finalized the Paris Rulebook, the rules governing the Paris Agreement, the thorniest issues of which had remained unresolved since 2015. And outside the negotiations, we heard commitments from countries, from businesses and finance to clean up sectors like power and road transport, to put an end to deforestation, to accelerate the pace of new technologies, and to support developing countries. For example, 34 countries and 5 public finance institutions committed to stop international support for fossil fuel energy by the end of 2022. And I want to thank the chief executives and the business owners from the FTSE 100 to the SMEs who came forward with commitments. As well, of course, as our COP partners, and some of whom are here today, a huge thank you to you as well. So friends, I believe that what we achieved together in Glasgow was significant. And when my team and I established priorities in 2020 with the support of our friends of COP Group, frankly, we questioned whether we were setting ourselves up to fail. And indeed, some thought that we were. And I have to tell you, I was advised that the chances of completing the Paris rulebook were pretty slim. After all, completion had eluded the world for a full 6 years. And when my team and I were deliberating on whether we should aim to consign coal power to history, I was warned that we would never get the word coal in a COP text. And yet, every country at COP has agreed to phase down coal power. And we can confidently say that 2021 was the year that killed off international public financing of coal power. Under the UK and Italy's respective G7 and G20 presidencies, we committed to end new international coal power financing by the end of 2021. And I have to say to you that a transformation is now afoot across the world. Last week, I spoke to a minister from a country that wasn't even talking about coal a year ago. And now they're saying no to new coal power. Frankly, many doubted we would see a shift of this sort. Yet we delivered our Glasgow goals, and we were able to do so because of the trust between countries that we'd worked so hard to build as a presidency. I spent much of last year building relationships. We held meetings in person ahead of COP despite the pandemic. And to ensure that this was a truly shared endeavor, we asked individual ministers from governments around the world to lead on critical negotiating issues. The Glasgow Climate Pact, I believe, is a product of international cooperation and a practical demonstration of global Britain in action. And of course, the climate attachés in the UK's diplomatic network played a vital role, just as they will throughout this year. All in all, there is no doubt that the commitments we secured at COP26 were historic. And yet, at the moment, they're just words on a page. And unless we honor the promises made to turn the commitments in the Glasgow Climate Pact into action, they will, sadly, wither on the vine. We will have mitigated no risks. We will have seized no opportunities. Instead, we will have fractured the trust built between nations, and 1.5 will slip from our grasp. So my absolute focus for the UK presidency this year is delivery. I'm under no illusions as to the scale of the tasks that we face, the difficult choices which countries must make, and the challenge we have as a presidency now that the lights have faded on the global stage in Glasgow. Working with Egypt, we must maintain the urgency and the energy as we approach COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. And just as leaders understood that it was in our collective self-interest to come together and forge the Glasgow Climate Pact, so that same collective interest should spur us to deliver at COP27. And that will become increasingly clear over 2022 and beyond as renewable prices fall further, the risks and opportunities become more apparent, and the science grows starker. And new reports from the IPCC this year will show the monumental risks that we face. So action must begin now. And it's precisely 12 weeks since world leaders held their summit in Glasgow, where they listened as Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados told us that a 2 degrees world is a death sentence, where leaders sat in compassionate silence at the request of youth activist Elizabeth Vathuti, who asked them to think of those whose stories are not heard and whose suffering is not felt. Where Sir David Attenborough inspired the world with his message that Our motivation should not be fear, but hope. So it is now time to honor our promises, to build on the trust and consensus generated in Glasgow, and deliver with integrity. And that requires action on both a domestic and international level. We need every country to play its part and honor the promises that they've made, but we must also work together. By aligning efforts internationally, countries can accelerate the pace of technological change. They can increase incentives for investment and innovate faster. Working in partnership, we can support a truly global transition. And at COP26, for instance, we launched the South Africa Just Energy Transition Partnership, through which countries came together to mobilize an initial $8.5 billion. And through international fora, we can set direction and we can spur action as we did ahead of Glasgow at the G7 and the G20. So the UK presidency will both urge countries to act individually and encourage cooperation. And we will do so around 4 key priorities. First, to ensure that countries reduce emissions as promised and go further to keep 1.5 alive. And that means encouraging countries with a net zero target to make a plan to get there if they haven't already done so. It means urging all governments to honor the Glasgow Climate Pact and revisit and strengthen their 2030 emission reduction targets as necessary. The G20 is my personal priority here, given that they're responsible for 80% of global emissions. That means asking all countries to turn their NDCs into policies and plans to deliver. Second, we aim to progress work on adaptation and loss and damage. We'll work with donor countries towards a commitment to double adaptation finance and with all parties to make progress towards the global goal on adaptation. We'll aim to progress the Glasgow dialogue on loss and damage, and we will further operationalise the Santiago network, including its funding by COP27. Third, we want to deliver finance to support these efforts. We will urge developed countries to implement the delivery plan on the $100 billion goal and support developing countries. And by COP27, we must be able to show that we are on a trajectory to meet that $100 billion goal. And we will work with all parties to make progress on the post-2025 climate finance goal as well. We're also going to have to encourage the financial firms and the DFIs, the development finance institutions that have made commitments to deliver with integrity. And with others, we will build on the work that we have done with South Africa to unleash private and public money to fund the transition from fossil fuels to clean energy in other high-emitting countries, supporting their national plans. Our fourth and final goal is to push for further action across critical sectors such as coal, cars, and ending deforestation. And we will urge countries to act, and we will work with partners to turn promises into clear delivery plans through the Energy Transition Council, the Zero Emission Vehicles Transition Council, the FACT Dialogue, and the Breakthrough Agenda. And in all of this, we will work hand in hand with our COP27 partner, Egypt, and support the holder of COP28, the UAE, both of which I visited earlier this month. And we will learn from the success of Glasgow, continuing to build trust and relationships, working through international fora, and continue to engage with civil society and young people. So friends, these are ambitious plans for our presidency year, and rightly so. Because as Margaret Thatcher, one of the first major international leaders to sound the alarm on climate change, argued in 1989, the environmental challenge which confronts the whole world demands an equivalent response from the whole world. Every country will be affected and no one can opt out. Her words are as true today as they were then, more than 30 years ago. What has changed in that time is the extent of our knowledge and the urgency of our task. Such awareness has given rise to a collective self-interest, powerful enough to deliver international consensus in a fractured world. The question now is whether, in full knowledge of the consequences, we choose to squander or realize that gain. The answer should be obvious. I have to say to you, after what was a pretty exhausting year, I settled down to catch up on some popular culture over Christmas. And like many others, including you, I suspect, I watched Don't Look Up. You've seen it. But that final line stayed with me. We really did have everything, didn't we? So I say to you today, we do have everything, and we mustn't throw it away. There is no more time to sit tight and assess. We must deliver together now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for a fantastic speech. While everybody is thinking about their questions, and people online, if you can carry on typing in questions, I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask one myself. And that is, no, I'm going to ask two, actually, briefly. You put a lot of emphasis in the presidency on delivering the enormous public and private financial flows. You made a lot of progress, you made a lot of pledges, but what are the kind of key and concrete next steps? Because despite all the pledges, there is still very much a gap. And then my second one, if I could just slip that in while others are thinking, a lot of the zeitgeist around COP was about raising the ambition, coming back with new NDCs. How optimistic are you that countries will come back with revised NDCs in the short term? And a bit cheekily, will the UK be one of those? So if you could answer those, people think about your questions, and then I'll come back to you in a second.
Thank you for that, Tim. So look, I mean, I think in terms of finance, I've said this before, the reality is without finance, it makes everything else very, very difficult, particularly for developing nations. And that's why I was very keen that we set out this delivery plan on the 100 billion. And I want to thank our friends in the Canadian and German governments for working with us on that, and of course the OECD. What we saw in that plan is that whilst we are pretty unlikely to hit 100 billion in 2020, which I think was the original plan, we should get there in 2023 at the latest, and we expect there's a 500 billion will be deployed over that 5-year period from 21 to 25. But you will also have heard there were announcements made from Japan, Norway, and others at COP26. So I think one of the things that we need to do is see whether we can accelerate the plan in terms of getting to the 100 billion. I think the second issue, which I refer to in my speech as well, is on adaptation. And I think for a long time, many developing countries have felt that adaptation has effectively been the poor cousin of mitigation. And that's why the doubling of climate finance for adaptation by 2025 really was well received. But then we need to show that that is starting to happen. And we talk a lot about the 100 billion. That's absolutely vitally important. It is a totemic figure. But actually, we also need to unleash more private finance here as well. And I think there's a real role for the multilateral development banks working together with the private sector to play in getting more money into developing countries. I mean, I actually think Mark Carney and the team have done a great job in making sure they've got $130 trillion of assets committed to net zero. But my ask of them has been, how is this actually going to translate into money on the ground in developing countries? And there is a work stream as part of GFANZ, actually led by the CEO of Macquarie Bank, looking at precisely this. How do we ensure that that money comes across? And the final thing I'd say to you is that, and I talked about this in the speech, is that in the same way that we got countries to come together to provide a package of £8.5 billion to help with the energy transition in Eskom in South Africa, I think one of the things we need to look at is if there are other such country platforms that we could also coalesce around as part of the international community. And in terms of NDCs, well, as I said to you, I mean, I think we're going to ask every country to come forward. Big focus for me is going to be on the G20. And will the UK come forward? Well, I think we've got a pretty ambitious NDC, and many of you will have seen the report that the CCC, the Climate Change Committee, produced after COP, setting out what they wanted us to be doing. And I think they made the point that the UK needs to focus on delivery. And clearly, we're going to have to follow the science along with everybody else and see where we go. But it is going to be about delivery. And they also made the point about how we work through international fora like the G7 and G20 to urge others to come forward as well. And that's clearly something that we will be doing.
Great. Thank you very much. Right. I don't quite know how we're going to do this because we've already got 20 questions online, and I can probably see 20 hands, and we've got 20 minutes. So I will pick 3 questions, and if you can wait, if I call you, wait sitting down, boom mic will come to you, take your mask off, ask your question, come back on. Online audience, I will come back to you 3 questions in a minute. Because of the complexities of what we're trying to do, and we're very concerned about these sort of things, I will try and not just have a white male audience, if that's all right, and so more women put their hands up. So let's just start off at the front here, 1, 2, 3, and then I'll try and be a bit more equitable towards the back.
First of all, thank you so much for your wonderful message of hope, because without kind of a real will to have a new vision for humanity and for investing in well-being, we are not going to do this. But you talked very lucidly about the new arrangements around adaptation and how we need to work together more closely to coordinate delivery of the monies that will be made available through private and public sector finance and the development banks. And what has been implied, but you haven't said explicitly, is how you envisage a co-construction, as it were, between local communities who need this money and de-risking the capital for them to use, and to make sure that there's a coherent, nationally aligned program that allows this to really deliver on climate adaptation and lowering the risk of warming by restoration of environments. Rather long question, sorry.
Can you just introduce yourself? Sorry, I forgot to say.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to introduce myself, I always do. Hilda Raab, Centre for International Peacebuilding.
Are you all right to write these down as we go through? Number 2, then, please, sir.
John Wilson. I'm a member of Chatham House, a journalist, and a member of a number of other think tanks and involved in politics. Mr. Sharma, despite your best endeavours, I put it to you that the COP26 Glasgow summit was in fact a failure, and your ensuing year as president will be blighted because Russia and China are now too powerful to be made to abide by your rules, which, as we all know, are really necessary to achieve proper global warming.
And the question? Can you get to the
That
question?
that is the question.
It sounded more like a comment to me. But I'll pass that to Mr. Sharma in a minute. Final question in this round.
Thank you very much. Tricia de Borgraaf, Chatham House member and current affairs writer. I know it's a bit of a loaded question, but I really would welcome your thoughts on the role of nuclear energy with regards to climate action. We all know this is a dual-use technology. We have yet to find safe and sustainable ways of the disposal of radioactive waste. This needs politically stable countries. It needs environmentally stable conditions. And this is an industry that I won't put it in your words, but in my words, is renowned for its lack of transparency when things go wrong. And you're talking now about a global collective action. I just wanted very quickly to say on these small nuclear modules that everybody thinks are very sexy right now, there is evidence to point that we will need about 10 of these small nuclear reactors to do the job of one large modern reactor. It's extremely expensive technology, especially compared to renewables, whose own lack of baseload capacity, if you want, really should be put into that context that these nuclear reactors will take at least 10 years, if not more, to come online. And from an industry that I hate to say is known for its delays and cost overruns. So my rather loaded question, I'm afraid, to you, since I think it's pretty obvious where I'm coming from, is given the nature of today's, sadly, inescapable realities, and that will have to include cyber attacks and terrorism and new geopolitical rivalries, you name it, as well as tsunamis and deadly storms, etc. In your view, is nuclear power an acceptable source of clean energy? Thank you.
Thank you. And can I add to that question the follow-up question, which is where does gas fit in to what is a sustainable energy source? Because we've had lots of questions about that. So over to you, sir.
Shall I have a go? Thank you. Look, I think the first question was around, effectively it's around sort of access to finance. And one of the things that I think we, when we took on the COP26 role, understood very quickly is that you can talk about the billions and the trillions, but actually what you need to make sure is this money is actually getting on the ground and that people are able to get access to finance. So one of the things that we did very early on, actually we had a very good discussion with civil society before we set this up, was a climate and development ministerial meeting in March. And coming out of that, we set up an access to finance task force co-chaired by the UK and Fiji. And at COP26, we then announced 5 pilot projects in developing countries, Rwanda, Jamaica, 3 others, Bangladesh, where there are pilots going to be run. So we can precisely get information on how you improve the access to finance in these countries and get that money on the ground. And I think in terms of the MDBs, for instance, I mean one of the big discussions that there has been, if you talk to the private sector, is that whether there is scope to set up, for instance, first loss capabilities through MDBs, through the international financial institutions, to then allow on the back of that for the private sector to come in. And I think we need to see a lot more of this innovation, quite frankly, in the financial space, because otherwise, we're always going to be talking about those trillions, and they will be unconnected with actually getting money on the ground. I think the second issue, so you asked me whether Glasgow was a failure. It won't surprise you to hear that I don't think it was a failure. And I'll tell you why I don't think it was a failure, is because firstly, we managed to get almost 200 countries to agree to this pact. And as I described to you, we were in this position last year as well, a really fragmented world. I mean, you can see around you what is going on in the world in terms of the conflicts and potential conflicts. We were in the same place last year, and yet we did manage to get almost 200 countries to sign up. And we had a number of firsts that came through in this pact. The first is that we got every country to agree to come back by the end of 2022 to look again at their 2030 emissions reduction targets. No one thought that was going to be possible. Literally no one thought that was going to be possible. We agreed the rules of the Paris Agreement. Again, very few thought we would get things like Article 6, transparency frameworks agreed. Very few did. And then, of course, we also managed to get decisions on coal. If I'd been giving a speech here this time last year and I said to you, by the time we get to the end of Glasgow, not only will every country, every major country have committed to not do any more international coal financing, but actually they will all have also signed up to phase down coal use. Frankly, can I ask you, how many of you would have said that was going to be possible? Show of hands. No. Okay. Well, we got that over the line. And when we set out, we had less than 30% of the global economy covered by a net zero target. We're now at over 90%. So, I would say that actually what we achieved was historic. Certainly that's the feedback I've had from many governments and civil society. But none of that will matter literally none of that will matter unless those commitments are turned into action. And that's why, I think as Tim said, I said after Glasgow, and I've repeated again, it was a fragile win. But it's only going to be that heartbeat of 1.5 will only be strengthened if countries continue to deliver. And I think the issue on nuclear, look, I've said whenever I've gone around the world to every country, they have to decide what their energy mix is. But what you're increasingly seeing is the desire and the move to renewables, to clean energy. When I was Base Secretary of State, we put out a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. It's the Prime Minister's plan. And part of that, we were very clear that as a government, we supported nuclear, both big nuclear and small nuclear. But every country has to make a choice. There are some countries in Europe, in Asia, for whom nuclear is not going to be part of the mix. Nevertheless, they also want to get to the point where they have a clean energy transition. So one of the things that I've made sure I do not do is go around the world and lecture people and tell them what their energy mix should be. It's up to them to decide. But where we can support them, as we're doing with South Africa, in going from coal to a clean energy transition, that's something that developed countries are going to have to do increasingly.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take a couple of online and then I'll come back to the audience. So I have to remove my glasses to do this. Daisy Dunn from Carbon Brief. What are your thoughts on calls from some in the Conservative Party for the UK to invest more in UK oil and gas because of the energy crisis? Is this in the spirit of what was agreed in Glasgow? ? Then from Megan Rowling from Reuters, what do you see as the presidency's concrete next steps on loss and damage? And then from Ben Webster of The Times, have any of the G20 countries indicated to you since COP26 they will increase their NDC ambitions?
Great, thank you for that. So I think the first question I think Daisy raised is about our energy mix. I think we need to, there's a certain conflation that is going on about what is happening in terms of gas prices right now and what that means in terms of net zero. I mean, I have to say to you that I do not believe the two are connected. The reality is the reason that we have got gas prices going up 300-400% the last year is a combination of macroeconomics and geopolitics. And I mean, you all understand that, so we don't need to go into that. But clearly, people in the UK will want to see support coming through with the cost of living. And there is support being provided through the Warm Homes discount, the support that's provided to pensioners, and of course there's extra money that's been given to local authorities, again, to support those who are most in need. Ultimately, that issue in terms of helping people with the cost of living is a matter for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister, and I hope we'll hear more on that. But I do think that is separate from the issue of achieving net zero. And I go back to the point that if you want to have security of supply domestically, and if you want to keep prices low, and you want to cut emissions, which is what, by the way, we have signed up to in the Conservative Party manifesto, then what you need to do is more of what we have been doing, which is continue to build out renewables. We've got, I think, about 11 or 12 gigawatts of offshore wind right now. It's been a huge success story. Right? When I've gone around the world, people have said, this is the UK leading the way. We know that by 2030, we want to push that out to 40 gigawatts. And of course, on top of that, you need to make sure that you push further in terms of the base load. And that's why we're going to be doing more on nuclear. And by the way, this isn't sort of me saying this. If you listen to people like Fatih Birol, who runs the IEA, I mean, he will tell you that, this is what is happening in terms of gas prices, not a reason to stop the move towards clean energy and net zero. In fact, it should provide a spur for countries to do more in this direction. I think Megan from Reuters asked about loss and damage. Well, we agreed the Glasgow dialogue. Ultimately, sorry, I'm getting a bit techie here, but the subsidiary body is going to be leading off on this. The key issue, I think, during this year is to see progress in that area. And I know that having talked to our colleagues in Egypt, that's again something that they will want to see. And people have different views about where that conversation ends. The key thing is that we try and build consensus around a common solution, and that's work that has already started. And I think the final question from Ben is, do I expect any of the G20 to increase their ambitions? I mean, what I'd say in response to that is that if you have a look, there were a number of G20 nations that announced their NDCs, which have not yet been improved NDCs actually, which have not been formally reported to the UNFCCC, so they count as part of the process. That's obviously something that we will want to see happen during this year. There are a range of countries that announced new policy formulations, which are not reflected in their NDCs. Obviously, we would want those to be reflected as well by the end of this year. And then, of course, there are countries that just haven't improved their NDCs at all, and we will be pressing them to improve those NDCs.
Great, thank you very much. Right, we've probably only got time. If you keep your questions brief, I will go 1, 2, 3. And then if questions are brief, there's a chance for another round. It's above you.
Can you do more to call out greenwashing? And can you be specific on how coal can be phased down? Nicholas McLean.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Nat Seddon, Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford and a friend of COP. Thank you for your vision and your leadership. Just reflecting, if I may, on your words about net zero. Clearly, we embrace the fact that companies and governments across the world are embracing net zero, but very, very few of them are underpinned by robust science-based plans. Many of them rely on negative emissions technologies, which are in no way yet ready to go to scale, and have an over-reliance on tree plantations, which could do a lot more harm than good. So I want to know what we're going to be doing this year to ensure that the UK in particular delivers a very robust science-based net zero plan. And linked to this, what are we going to be doing to ensure that the Glasgow Leaders' Pledge or Declaration on Forests is the success that the New York Declaration on Forests was not? Thank you.
No, blue shirt. Lady in the blue shirt, Emily.
Emily Chopra from the University of Cambridge. One of the innovations of the UK presidency was the focus on sectors with coal and electric vehicles and deforestation and so forth. I wonder whether you feel that that's been a successful model and whether you'd like to see it extended to other sectors.
Just one final question, because we need to. Fiona, if you can ask your question.
Yes, I think any... Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think any fair-minded person would say that Glasgow was a huge achievement, but since then we've seen some terrible things happening. In the United States, Joe Biden is having great trouble pushing forward his agenda. China is expanding its coal production, and around the world, in fact, it's party time for coal in the context of the post-COVID energy crisis. Mr. Sharma, everything's falling apart, isn't it?
A good, sharp question from the press. Thank you very much, Fiona. Okay, so, Mr. Sharma, can you manage those?
Yes, thank you so much. I think the first question is on greenwashing. And I mean, I think this is something that, quite rightly, frankly, has been raised by civil society, that commitments ultimately have to be underpinned by the science. I mean, if you look, for instance, at GFANZ, I mean, those who are committing to it are required to set out their decarbonisation plans up to 2025 and 2030, and to do that on science-based targets. And there's an annual review of this process. And clearly, those who've signed up to GFANZ have up to 18 months to set out these plans. I think so. What we're all going to have to see is what happens in 18 months from now, and if those institutions that have signed up are not, having science-based targets on decarbonising, then they should no longer be part of that GFANZ grouping. I mean, that's the whole intention, and I think that's something that everyone will look to. The other thing, I think the other issue that was raised was in terms of coal phase down. So I talked about the reduction in the in the pipeline, and I think it's been really quite significant over the past 5-6 years. I mean, if you recall, it's only the commitment to end international coal financing from some of the countries that have been doing it came into place at the end of 2021. And I think that was really quite significant, and we will see the impact of that over the next few years. And anyway, if you talk to the private sector, they are really reluctant to invest in coal because what they can see is the direction of travel. They can see that they're going to end up with potentially stranded assets. That is a reason that you will not see a great deal of private sector money going in there. So, I mean, what I would say is that, let's have this conversation again in a few years and see where we've got to in terms of coal. I mean, domestically, of course, we had around 40% of our electricity mix was coming from coal in 2012. We are now at, below 2%, and I think by October 2024, we want to ensure that there's no more coal in our energy mix. So again, the UK has been leading on this issue. I think in terms of, I think the second question was again similarly on sort of science-based targets. One of the things that you will have noted that the Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced at COP26 is that UK financial institutions and listed companies will be required to set out their own transition plans. And to ensure that these are robust, there is going to be a task force which will be appointed, which will look to ensure that these plans are indeed robust and are science-based. And I think that actually is a really very positive development in terms of what we are doing domestically. And in addition to that, again, at the World Leaders Summit, you will have heard Antonio Guterres talk about setting up his own task force in looking at these issues. So, I mean, let's see how that work moves forward. On the issue of the forest pledge, yes, this is the case for all of the commitments that we've made. There are a whole range of mechanisms already in place to track them. I think in the case of forests, again, there are a number of existing mechanisms that are in place. But I think the really positive thing here is that underpinning the requirement of these pledges was about $14 billion. And I'm pretty sure that both the public and private sector institutions that are going to be putting money in to end deforestation will want to see results. I mean, it will be on the basis of producing results as well. So that, I think, if nothing else, will ensure that people do keep to the commitments that they have made. I think Emily raised this issue about different sectors. Yes, I mean, you'll know the Prime Minister's talked about coals, cars, cash and trees. And actually, it's worked because one of the things that we did at the start, and when we sort of took on this role back in 2019, was to say that not only were we going to focus on the technical negotiations, but also we were going to connect the real world economy to what was going on at COP26. And we decided that we would have sector focus. So we very early on, we said we were going to have a transition council made up of ministers around the world looking at energy, looking at transport, and we followed this through, agriculture as well. We followed this through to the commitments that you saw from the private sector as well in these sectors. So, yeah, I mean, I hope there's an opportunity to build through other sectors as well. And as you know, the Glasgow Breakthroughs as well has set out a whole range of sectors that will be covered. So we'll see where we get to. Maybe I should come back this time next year, and we'll see what's actually been achieved. Finally, the question about whether everything is falling apart. Look, I don't think things are falling apart. I think what we're going to have to look at is what happens over a period of time, what happens over a cycle in terms of the movement. As I said to you, if you look at coal and the pipeline, significantly reduced over the last 6 years. I mean, let's see what happens over the next few years. As I said, particularly when you look at the commitments that have been made on ending international coal financing, I think that will make a big, big difference as well. In terms of the US, I mean, I very much hope that the US, the current administration will push forward and get over the line the commitments that they're seeking. actually having the US back on the front line, the fight against climate change, has been very positive. And I want to pay tribute, of course, to John Kerry as well, who's done a really sort of heroic job together with many others to ensure that we had success at COP26.
Right, thank you very much, Mr. Sharma. I'm sorry, we don't have any more time because we are already 30 seconds past 1 o'clock. I have done very badly. We've got 40-odd questions online and hundreds of people in the room who would like to ask extra questions. A really big thanks to the Right Honourable Alok Sharma for coming and talking to us. Whatever one might think about the success, the ambition of COP26, no one can doubt his personal commitment to drive things forwards. So really great thanks for you coming here. So thanks very much to you online and in real life. In a couple of minutes, if you could just wait for us to leave the stage, there will be cups of coffee upstairs at the top of the main stairs in the Neil Malcolm room. Thanks very much to the Cabinet Office team for helping us put this event on. Thanks very much to the Chatham House behind the scenes team, and thanks to you all for being really engaged. And I'm very sorry we didn't get to all of the questions, but there might be ways of harvesting your question and getting a response. Thank you very much. So if you just let us run away first and then follow us out through the door. Thank you very much.